Hello, hi, what's up, everyone? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and we are doing it big on Halloween, courtesy of an interview with Puloma Ghosh, the author of Mouth. Her debut collection of short stories are eerie, otherworldly explorations of gender, desire, isolation, and so much more. Paloma, thank you so much for coming onto the channel and chatting with me.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy Halloween.
Of course, you too. Do you have any Halloween plans?
I am going to a party. I'm out of town right now, so I'm excited to get back. But I love Halloween. I love dressing up. I've been a little busy this year, so my costume is a bit last minute.
Yeah,
But I'm gonna be a vial of the substance from the substance.
very fun. I feel like I'm not very good at thinking of costumes. Okay, but I do want to go back in time just a little bit. Can you talk about the genesis of Mouth? What was the first story you started working on? Where were you? What was on your mind? Was it an image or a line that came to you? Let's take us back.
Yeah, I think the oldest story in the collection is The Fig Tree, which I wrote like very soon after it was really quite a long time ago now, I think like 8 years.
Mhm.
And it was like before I even went to grad school or anything, but I had just gone to India for the first time in a while and visited my family in various cities. Did some sightseeing with my partner, um, and at the time, my grandmother's old house, which um, was like had been in my family for a long time. My dad grew up in it and everything. It was currently not being occupied,
Mhm.
um, but I wanted to go see it, and it was really in like it was a bit derelict. Like they since then they've demolished it and are building
Oh,
something new on it. But that was the last time I saw that house, and um, it was just like an odd feeling because I also hadn't been back in. It was I think the longest stretch. It was like 6 years maybe,
yeah,
like a long time.
for sure.
Um, and so I felt this like time collapsing. I felt myself changed. Um, and that sort of like image of the house was the impetus for the story. I also had just started to play with adding speculative elements into my work, which I didn't do for a little while straight out of college because I don't know, I like was drinking the Kool-Aid of like serious fiction is realistic, and there wasn't as much speculative fiction out there as there is now that wasn't strictly genre. So I was also exploring that, and that kind of opened up my work and helped me get into the stories I wrote later. Of course, I like edited the story a lot years later,
Yeah,
but those first strokes were back then.
definitely. That makes sense. And when it comes to the the collection of stories, it's right here, Mouth. How did you approach what went into the collection? Were there other stories that didn't make the cut? What was the most fun to write, and what story changed the most? Was it the fig tree, or was it something else?
Um, I just honestly was just writing a lot of stories, and by the time I finished grad school, I had like a good set, and that like felt in conversation with each other. So I thought maybe I should try to query with a collection. I enjoy writing short stories, and I feel like I do strong work there. So I thought it might be a good way to debut. Um, for what was fun to write, I think Anomaly was fun to write. It came together pretty fast.
Mhm.
I did very minor edits on it. I think it just like very rarely a story just comes to you like clear as day, and all you have to do is write it down. And that was a story like that because usually there's a process of like you write an initial draft down, and then you have to like work out like what am I trying to do here, what is the story about, like what is like in the center of it. But for Anomaly it was just like so clear cut in my head that it just came out really fast. And as far as one that was difficult to write, Natalia was difficult to write. It went through a lot of iterations, um, a lot of drafts, and um, it took a while before I decided to put it into the autopsy format. So yeah, that was a journey.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, both of those stories are two that really stand out in my memory as well. I wanted to reference your interview with Books Are Magic, that chat that you had there. You were discussing obsessions, and I wanted to know what were the obsessions that were guiding this book, and what obsessions do you have right now?
I think um I think the stories came out from like a pretty like dark period
Mhm.
of my life, and also just like I think, which is like not in like an exceptional way. I think everybody goes through like the some difficulty in their 20s as they're like figuring out
Mhm.
who they are, who they want to be, like how far are they from the version of themselves that would make them happy. And I think that like some of the obsessions had to do with feeling trapped, and also like wanting an out from like the things, and like loneliness and isolation, all these things that you experience when you are like thrown into the world as an adult for the first time. Um, of course, like monsters. I love monsters, and I just had like an instinct to put a monster in like every story that I was writing. Just because I feel like it's so freeing, and
Mhm.
it like allows you, it opens up possibilities for your characters um that weren't available beforehand. Um and I think also like sex is a bit of an obsession in this
Yeah.
collection. I think because of the general age group of the characters, it's a time where like I don't know, I think sex feels important, big, and sometimes new. Um, and it is like so entangled in, not for everybody, but like for these characters in particular, and it felt so entangled in their growth and also their like character development. Um, as far as what I'm obsessed with now, I don't know. I I think obsession is one of those things where like, yeah, I have like things that I'm into right now. Like I'm like into vampires right now.
Yeah.
But I've also always kind of been into vampires, but I'm having like a vampire resurgence. But I think obsessions are like, but besides that, like the real obsessions are things that you kind of figure out um later in hindsight.
Mhm.
Because when you're in it, you're just like, you don't realize how much you're fixating on something all the time. And then like 5 years later, you look back at your work and like how you spent your time and everything, and what you consumed and what you were talking about all the time, and you realize like, oh, these were like my obsessions. So as what I'm obsessed with now, like, we'll
We'll
see.
see. Yeah. Definitely. That makes sense. And I think you were kind of speaking about this, how the short story collections, they tie in, they're dealing a lot with loneliness and desire. And considering that most of your characters exist in the tension between alienation and their desire for connection, it's interesting because there are moments in the text where your characters do have the possibility to connect with someone. I'm thinking about the narrator in Lemon Boy who chooses not to um, follow the boy and go through the hole, and also the narrator of Anomaly who chooses to leave Amir when she was supposed to be doing something with a partner. How do you interpret those moments? Are they acts of fear, self-preservation, or perhaps moments of agency?
I think it's moments of agency, because I think in both of those cases it's like seeking connection at all costs, or like or like trying to find like trying to do something to achieve connection that isn't exactly what you need necessarily. I mean, Lemon Boy is a little bit different because I think Lemon Boy is less a person that she's connecting with and more like a darker instinct that she's connecting with. The like possibility of like disappearing in a way. But with Amir, it's also like she is connecting with another person just like as a way of not connecting with the person that's like still kind of haunting her.
Hmm.
And I think those are, you're right to say that they're like moments of agency where the person chooses what they really need to do, which is for an Anomaly, it was like to connect with herself because throughout this first part of the story, she's very much like in denial about her own feelings and her own needs. And then in Lemon Boy, she's choosing to not walk into the void.
Yeah, definitely. Um, okay, so many of these stories are not defined by one space. There's kind of this like dreamlike eerie quality to them, but there are two stories, we've spoken about them, that do seem really connected to space. They're The Fig Tree and Lemon Boy. What role does physical space play in those two stories? And do you see the place shaping the characters' emotional or narrative journeys differently versus the the stories that are more like ambiguous in their setting?
The stories you should just said was The Fig Tree and
Lemon Boy. Those
Lemon
to me seem
Boy.
like really rooted in place versus the others are kind of just like the story of like the college campus scene, or the girl in the first story who's in like figure skating as her space. Like those ones are more ambiguous to me.
I think like in those stories, those are like hauntings in a way, and I think like place is important for hauntings. Like why is this like entity occupying this space? I also think that in The Fig Tree, this character is kind of like in this place that is familiar and also unfamiliar, and that's a reflection of like walking through life after grief where you're in the same spaces, you're seeing the same things, but there's something missing, and that changes that space for you. So I think in that way it's setting is really important. um and then with Lemon Boy, the house is like, I just think a party is very um it's a very liminal space.
Mhm.
There's like, especially a huge party, there's like a lot of mini like it's not a cohesive thing. It's kind of like a many armed beast. And so I felt like it sh- the progress of that story is her sort of sinking into that. And so the the house kind of becomes a container for that liminal space. It's a thin place, it's a bad place, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Um, okay, so you mentioned that these stories stem from reflections on being young and in your 20s. What do you think about what do you think it is about this stage of life that lends itself to these themes, the discomfort, the alienation? Were there any specific experiences from your own life that maybe were like translated into the text, or you found challenging to translate into fiction?
I think like, and I'm just saying like 20s because that just happens to be the era that
Yeah.
I wrote these stories in for me personally, but I think like there are moments of transition in our lives, both internal and external. Um, and for me, that happened in my 20s. And I think for other people, it could happen earlier or later. But those moments feel like very amorphous. Like you yourself feel kind of jelly inside. You're like reevaluating and reassessing things. And then the places around you and the people you spend time with also feel kind of um, like thin, and you're not quite finding purchase in it yet because you haven't spent enough time with it. And so I think that is part of what came into these stories. And also just like being at an age where you your life is still full of possibilities, and you haven't really like crossed any bridges that you can't return from yet. So you are so like wrapped up in figuring out like where you want to wind up.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
No, that does. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, like you were mentioning the party at the house space is like a liminal space, a container, and it's kind of like each of these stories is a container to represent that like transition and the liminal nature that is going through changes and trying to figure out what's next.
Yeah.
Okay, so you straddle a few different genres. There seems like it doesn't seem like there is a horror and speculative bent to it, a little bit of fantasy, like these fantastical, possibly like vampire characters and things like that. What draws you to horror and like fantasy speculative stuff?
I really I'm like a consumer of all of these things. I really enjoy stories that like expand possibilities and like introduce me to things that are like completely outside of what I know. I think it can be really imaginative as well. I'm always impressed by people who do like big fantasy sci-fi worlds. Um, and I enjoy horror because it is like a bit of my like thrill seeking. Like you won't catch me scaling a mountain, but I do enjoy the psychological thrill seeking of consuming horror. And I also think that horror is like a genre that is always more than it is. Like it's always using the otherworldly and the frightening to talk about something that is grounded.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they can often like reflect like social issues and like the concerns of the times and stuff. So I think in that it's like a genre that is very full and um like has a lot of depth to it. As far as like why I like to put that into my own work, I think that I find possibility in the uncanny and the unknown. I have so much freedom and license. As soon as you break one rule of the world, whether it's like physics or like what creatures we know to exist, etc., um, you can break any rule and you can take it wherever you want. So I find that to be very liberating in my writing.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's almost as if those elements allow you to say something that you wouldn't otherwise be able to say if it was just so grounded in reality.
Yeah, I just would have to like I would have to dig into like how do I get these characters to confront these things and have to like contrive it from
Mm-hmm.
like realistic possibilities, whereas like how do I make this character do this thing? Well, here's like a ghost that scares them and puts them in this like stressful situation where they have no choice but to confront these things. It's kind of like Anomaly. Like
Yeah,
this character is like so resistant to confront her grief, you know, but what does it ultimately is like this weird space where like you don't understand where you are and you have nobody to confront but yourself, and so she
mm-hmm.
is like now alone with herself in this weird space.
Definitely. Um, I was reading one of your interviews and you mentioned how dreams can inspire some of your stories, and I sort of had like a mini light bulb moment where I was like, to me it kind of explained the atmospheric nature of your stories, that you know that there's like dreams never feel real and there's something like similar while you're reading this. Um, so when it comes to that connection of the dreams and fiction, do you write your dreams down? Do you dream often? Like, what's going on?
I dream a lot, actually. I just had a weird dream last night. Like I dream like very often.
Yeah.
I used write down my dreams when I was in high school. I started doing that. I'm on and off with it. But if you start writing down your dreams, it helps you remember them. And I don't always remember every detail, but like things like stand out to me and I like kind of keep them in a note, especially because I watch a lot of horror movies. I consume a lot of scary things. So like I have nightmares like a lot. I had a nightmare the other night. Um, and I I always wake up scared, especially if I wake up in the middle of the night and
Yeah.
like um then the next day, if it's something that really, really scared me, I like kind of take note of it. And if I use it in my work, it kind of like dulls the fear a little bit. I get to take control over whatever scared me. So in that way, I kind of like master my own fear.
I find that so interesting because I don't have many nightmares, but I like have a lot of dreams, and I'm like, well, maybe I need to watch more like scary movies, and that will like light up my dreams.
Yeah, I've been watching scary movies since I was like probably too young, like since I was like a tween. So
Yeah,
I think that like slowly it's just become really baked into my psyche. And I mean, I watch a scary movie like almost like at least once a week. Um, so I think the more you have exposure to stuff, the more it like takes up, starts paying rent in your brain. Like
like ingrained in your subconscious.
totally.
Uh, Okay, so you also have mentioned in the past that you paint, and I think it's so interesting when authors have these other like artistic avenues. Like I was reading an interview with Percival Everett, and he like did an abstract expressionist like exhibition or something like that. Like the man does a lot. So I wanted to know, how does painting inform your writing?
I think it makes me like attentive to things. I actually like have to go back into my writing and the editing a lot and make sure that I'm using all the senses in describing things because I get really fixated on the visual because I feel like I'm always paying attention to light and color. Um, and I'm not like a professional artist, but it's something that I've been doing for my entire life. So I think it informs just the lens that I look at everything through. And I think it can be helpful because when you spend time looking at something, it kind of like depersonalizes it. It makes it no longer like it's kind of like saying like a word over and over again until the sounds like kind of lose all meaning and start to sound weird. So I think that can help me with like figurative writing as well because I can really look at an object or look at a scene and consider what else has the same like descriptive cues and then set comparisons.
For sure, I think that makes sense. And when you're engaging in your artistic practices, do you have music playing, whether it's writing or painting? Like, what do you
Um,
listen to podcasts? Like, what's happening?
I used to do music a lot, but I think nowadays, like sometimes I'll put on something on TV or something, but usually it can't be something that I have to look at a lot because obviously my eyes are on the page.
Yeah,
But I love to paint while listening to audiobooks. So that's like a big one.
for sure, that makes sense. Okay, I want to take a second to chat about the short story form because it's something that can really rile up readers. They're either all for them or they're like, no, no way, I never touch a short story collection. And I just wanted to know what draws you to the form and how would you describe a successful short story? Like, what are you looking for?
I just like how direct and just immediate short stories are. You have so little real estate, it has to pack a punch. I feel like reading a novel is like drinking a cocktail, and reading a short story is like knocking back a shot of tequila. So it like you get so much, like you can get such an impact like so fast, and I think it is like fun to also see how each author utilizes that limited space differently, because you have space to like meander in a novel, and you can sort of like take the long road to your point. You can delve into characters like entire histories if you want to. But with a short story, it's like, okay, I've got like, 12 odd pages. I can't give you this character's whole bio. So the choices that a writer makes in what they give you in a short story can be really interesting, can be really telling, and can be really unique. Um, I get why certain people don't enjoy short stories, because there are readers who um, really want to know everything about a world, and a short story simply does not allow that. So if you're like a completionist, if you want to, and this has happened often in especially writing speculative short stories, that people are always saying like, I want more. And like I've gotten feedback that's like, well, like, I wish we spent more time in this world, or like I wish we knew more about like what the origin of the speculative issue element is. But that's kind of like not the point. The point is like, what does this like moment make the character do and feel, and how is that like, what is that saying about ourselves and our world, and um etc. So I don't know. I think like it is just a matter of preference. Um but I really encourage people to give short stories a chance. I think that like some people would enjoy it but have a block about it. And there's some really really good collections out there that are a lot of fun. And like we have such busy lives. A novel is a commitment, and sometimes it takes me like weeks
Yeah.
to finish a novel, especially a longer one. But with a short story collection, you can just take little bites. You can read an entire story like in the like 30 minutes that you are like sitting with your book before you go to sleep, or like when you wake up in the morning, or your commute, and you don't have to feel that like, oh, I have to put it down, or like, oh, when am I gonna be able to get back to it? Um,
You would think that, like, with everyone's going on and on about how attention spans are dwindling and things like that, that people would gravitate towards a short story collection because they're quick. You can finish one so
yeah.
fast. Um, okay. And then you kind of mentioned this, that like a novel gives you that space to meander, whereas a short story, you have limited real estate, you need to be more direct. Considering that, when you are writing a short story, are you outlining, or do you just go to the page and you're like, let's see what comes out? Are you answering those questions that the reader would want to know why, or are you just omitting them as you're writing as well? You're just not even delving into the whys.
I write first with short stories, and I think I write first always. I think tone is really important. As you've said, like my writing tends to be more atmospheric, so I really need to connect with like the tone of my story um, before I can figure out where I'm going with it. So, yeah, I usually write the entire story first, and then I only outline, and I've done this like plenty of times. I outline if I'm finding structural issues. Um, and I want to figure out how to solve them, then I'll place my story into an outline. And that way it makes it easier to like see what happens if I move around scenes, or if I add something. What is the flow looking like? What is the emotional flow? How many scenes do I have, etc. Um, Novel writing, I outline because I feel like I need a guide because
Yeah.
I get lost in it. I'm like, wait, what's coming next? Like, where am I going with this? Um, so I think that is important. But with a short story, I think feeling is important. And if you like overwork or over engineer it, you can lose something.
Yeah, I think that the word that you use, like feeling your way through the short story, is a very important one. It's good to keep in mind. Okay, so speaking of, we've touched upon the first draft of a short story. You're just moving through it, feeling your way through the story. But when it comes to revisions, um, what are you? How many revisions are you doing? What are you looking for? When do you know the short story is done?
Um, I the number of revisions depends on the story. I think that people are always saying there's a struggle of like, when is it done? In some ways, like, no story that you write will ever be like done because
Yeah,
you're never going to be done. So you will change, and then you'll look back at something and be like, oh, well, now that I'm the person I am now and not the person I was like a year ago, I would do something a little bit different here. But you kind of have to like let go and think about like what did you want in the moment that you were writing the story, and have you achieved it, and just leave it at that. Not like necessarily what you would do now. Like there's certain stories that I don't think I would write now that are in the collection, but are there for a reason because they served something for me in the moment that I wrote.
definitely.
So I think it's partly a letting go. As far as revision, I tend to when I'm doing my first couple of revisions, like I tend to just write from scratch again, top to bottom, with my like original
Draft on the side.
draft on the side, just because like it can help with flow, and it can also help with like um figuring out like what is important, because whatever is like preserved in your second write is the like keynotes. It's clearly like the thing that you strongly want in there. Um and then I'll like reconcile the drafts. Like if I go back and I'm like, well, I actually like this sentence from the first draft, but I didn't write that sentence in the second draft, I'll like put it back. Um and then as you get further along and you're more solidified in or like me, I'm saying you, but as I get further along, and I'm more solidified in like what the story is, then I'll make the edits smaller and smaller. And because short stories are so compact, like I just really try to go as light of a hand as possible towards the end. One sentence can change a lot.
Hmm.
So, if there's something missing, I'll try to see if I can add it in as like minimally as possible.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. I do want to ask one clarifying question. So, um, you have draft one on the side, there's this draft two in a new document. When you're doing this sort of rewrite, are you like keeping in mind, like I know in this paragraph something like this happens, so let me just like how like exact is it shifting over? Do you get what I'm saying?
Um, it's kind of like I will write like an exchange or a scene. I'll like rewrite it from like memory,
Okay, memory.
and then I'll look back. I don't like do the whole thing and then
Mm-hmm.
reconcile after. I'll do it by scene, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. Sometimes paragraph by paragraph. It's like if it's like a big meaty paragraph, I'll like rewrite it, and then I'll look back and I will like reconcile a little bit and be like, okay, I'm missing this, missing that. But like I don't always do it that way.
For sure.
I think editing is so like amorphous and like changeable depending on what you're working on, that I don't like to like say I always do something or like this is my process. I think that um what's most important is to be flexible and like cater to the needs of what you're working on.
Definitely, that makes sense. I think this is a good time to add that a couple months ago, I went to this chat that Lauren Groff was doing, and she was talking about how when she's working on her projects, she writes her drafts by hand and messy handwriting that she can't read, and then she keeps on reiterating on that and reiterating, and like she never wants to actually like be able to read her handwriting. She's just trying to figure out the story, and I think after that, that's when she then moves to a computer once she's done that a few times. I thought that was kind of an interesting, and it reminds me a little bit of like this process that you mentioned of the rewriting, though I know that they're not exactly the same.
Yeah, I'm not quite as I don't know, ritualistic about it, I think. I
Yeah,
mean, that's interesting. I think everyone has like their like rituals that they do when they're writing. Sorry, is there background noise?
it's okay. Sometimes there's like people cutting the lawn out here. It happens.
Um, yeah, I everyone has their own like little rituals they do, and like what kind of, it's really about like what unlocks like your, that like connection with your work, I think.
Definitely. Speaking of that, do you have any rituals when you're writing or like vibey music? What's happening?
I
How do you
love
set
to
the scene?
write. I don't always do this because, life
It's
is
okay.
busy. And I sometimes I have to write on the go, sometimes I write in an airplane, sometimes I write in a coffee shop. When I was like going to an office, I would write on my commute, which actually I was kind of crazy for that. Why was I whipping out a laptop at rush hour? But I did do that. Um, and sometimes I'll handwrite, sometimes I'll type. But my favorite environment is, I have a really nice office setup because I've been working remotely for a lot of years now. And I like to write at night. I have a bunch of like red and pink lights that I like to put on. And I like to write to horror movie soundtracks a lot, or just movie soundtracks in general.
Yeah,
I love to pick a soundtrack that I feel like connects with the work that I'm writing, and like really get into the zone with it.
definitely. That makes sense. Okay. And then when did you realize that you were a writer?
I think I've always been a writer, but I think one day I realized that like writing is not an identity. Writing is not an identity. It is something you can choose to do. It's a practice.
Hmm.
So it wasn't like I was like, one day I was like, this is my, I think maybe when I was younger, I was like trying to identify as a writer more. But after a while, I was like, this is actually like not a personality. Especially as I was meeting more writers, I was like, we're both writers, but that doesn't mean we align on, we have a shared experience.
Yeah,
Um, Writing is just like something that I do, and the more I do it, the more I am like a writer, if that
for sure.
makes sense.
I think that's a very healthy way to look at it. uh, man. Okay. And then I wanted to know a little bit about your relationship with reading. Growing up, did you read a lot? What were the kind of things that you were reading? And then while you were working on Mouth, um, what were you reading, or were you like, oh, I can't be reading something like this because it will leak into my work? Tell me about reading life.
Of course, I read a lot when I was growing up. I mean, I think that is like what makes people writers, is that they read a lot and they're like, I love this. I gotta do it. Um, but I I'm not a person who like can't read while they're writing. Sometimes I read less when I'm writing, but that's more of a time issue.
Yeah.
Because I need to spend hours like writing. I can't use those hours to read. Um, but I when I was writing Mouth, I had just started reading like getting more into like the speculative short story realm, and being like, oh, like this is like cool and exciting, and like kind of like what I feel the best doing. So I was discovering like, as all like speculative short story writers, I think like Carmen Maria Machado,
Hmm.
and also Karen Russell, and Kelly Link, and Mariana Enriquez, who's like possibly my favorite writer.
Yeah.
But then I was also reading like other things. I don't know. I read very like
What?
variously. Like I read Jeff Vandermeer, that trilogy, which I guess now is like
For
there's a
them.
fourth one, which I haven't read yet.
Yeah, me.
Um, and I like read like Kazuo Ishiguro. I read Lauren Groff. Um, God, what else? Um, I started reading things like Ursula Le Guin
Mm.
and Octavia Butler. Um, and I read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like all of these things. Like, I think reading too narrowly, I think is like unhealthy and can make your writing like same for me.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to make generalizations for other people,
For
but
sure.
yeah, when I'm writing, I try to read like various things that each have like a kernel of something I'm interested in or something I'm trying to do. Um, to help me like get ideas and also like become more like knowledgeable about what tradition I guess I'm writing from. So like I'm kind of like obsessed with vampires right now because I'm trying to write a vampire book, which
Yeah.
may not be successful. I'm just like playing around right now. Um,
What vampire books are
and
you reading?
I read Carmilla.
Yeah.
Um, I am waiting for my hold on the Historian, which I read in high school, but I
Me
would like to
too. Yeah.
reread.
It's a really big
Um,
book.
yeah, Anne Rice, like,
Yeah.
and oh, I read Thirst. That book was really good.
Okay.
I loved it.
Cool. I'll check that one.
And yeah, so just like whatever helps. And also just whatever I feel like.
Definitely. Okay. Are there any authors or books that you think should be on our radar? New releases or backlist? Something that you're like, the people need to be reading this.
I mean, if you're not reading Mariana Enriquez, you need to be reading Mariana Enriquez. I mean, I liked her novel, but I didn't like it as much as I love her short stories. Like, I think she's like just like a master of the horror short story. She's like got it. Thirst, I also would highly recommend. Um, I am like not sure entirely how to pronounce the author's name, so I'm not going to mangle it. But it's a novel that came out recently. And honestly, Ishiguro, like if you haven't read his work, um, it is really just like I don't know, so moving. I feel like quietly devastated, like have Ishiguro fall. I recommend it. I just reread The Remains of the Day and I was like, God, this book is like I literally like cried. I feel like it's hard to cry while you're reading a book because you don't have the emotional
Oh,
manipulation
I kind of cry a lot.
of personally like I need like the emotional manipulation of music that I get in like movies and stuff to really get a good cry going, but I was like
Yeah.
um it's just so good. And like also, congratulations Hong Kong. I
Mhm.
have been following her. Vegetarian was something I read when I was writing Mouth. I've been following her work for a long time. I like have all her books that are in English. Um and I would highly recommend her for sure.
For sure. I mean, she also writes in a way that's like very atmospheric.
Mhm.
Okay, and then you mentioned it slightly, but let's talk about what's next and what are you working on right now?
I'm working on a novel. We'll see.
Exciting.
I have a couple of novel ideas. I have one that I definitely want to write, that I started on about it's kind of like a ghost story. It's kind of a monster story. It's about going back to your hometown. It's about missing teenagers, um, all of that good stuff. Um, but I kind of hit a pause on it because I suddenly like wanted to write a vampire novel. But it's kind of something that I'm just doing randomly. So I'll see if it even lands. I've mentioned it in a couple of conversations, but it might be something that just disappears. So I feel like it's tough to talk about what I'm working on because um, you just kind of start working and then not everything you work on comes to fruition. So we'll
Totally.
see what
But
comes out the
fingers
other end.
crossed. Good things will come. Okay, and then I would love if you can tell the good people of YouTube where they can find you.
You can find me on Instagram or Twitter at Pulomeow. I'm not changing it.
Yeah,
And you can buy Mouth wherever books are sold.
very exciting. Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Paloma. This has been a great chat, and I hope you have a wonderful Halloween.
You too. Thank you.